Hey y'all, and welcome back to the Matriculate Monthly Webinars. As always, this is Marab, and today we're planning to do a deep dive into the next milestone moment with your high school fellows, and that's going to be centered around financial aid. So we're going to do a overall introduction to financial aid today. Here's a quick run through of what's on deck and just kind of like what we're going to cover. So what's the timeline for applying for aid? Where does financial aid come from and what are the main components? What other resources are available to help your students be able to finish applying? A checklist you can use to make sure your HSFs can complete their financial aid documents. And then really, what do I hope you come away with this? So one, really, no matter what your own experience has been in applying for aid, whether that's you as a student who's kind of like gone through this process, whether that's someone who hasn't had to gone through this, no matter kind of just like what your experience has been, I just want you to come away feeling that you feel ready, right, to support your high school fellows in the entire financial aid process. And part of that means being an expert in a few of these items, right? And so what are the main components and how can students access them? That you also just know the timelines for being able to submit aid and are able to develop a system with your high school fellows. So not only are they accountable to themselves and making sure that they're doing what they need to do, but they also feel accountable to you, right? And that you're checking in with them to making sure that they are doing everything they can to fulfill all these obligations so that when they do reach their institution that they have a financially fit experience. And really lastly, as an advising fellow, just knowing that your role here is just kind of being a support system. I'm not expecting you to fill out the FAFSA for any of your students or fill out the CSS profile for any of your students, right? You're kind of there to just kind of like know the information, really be able to guide your students if they have any questions or any guidance. If there's something that comes up that is super out of left field and you might not know the answers or don't understand like where to go, just know that there's a huge support system here to help you through all of them. So we don't expect you to be able to answer every single specific circumstance or scenario that can come up, but know that we want you to be experts in the sense of what is the overall process and generally then applying that to the students that you're working with. So here we are. This is where financial aid comes from, or most of it at least. So these are really the three main buckets, right? And where most students will see the majority of their aid. One's going to be the federal government, right? Every single student here, every single student we work with should be able to and should apply for federal aid. And this gets delivered to students in a variety of means, whether that's a grant, a loan, or even work study funds. Next up, we have the state government. And this is where you can also, where you come in as an advisor and being able to help navigate certain nuances. Since I'm coming from like a national perspective, and you'll be able to see obviously where your student's from and what specific programs they might have to apply for. So whether or not your student's state offers a tuition assistance program, but really importantly understanding which schools on their college list have a relationship with a state's tuition program that might make that school much more financially feasible for them too. And then lastly, and this, for a lot of you might be where you receive a lot of your own financial aid and could easily be a lot of the same for the students that we predominantly work with, and where they receive the most of their aid is going to be institutional aid. So this means that this is financial aid that's given by the school through a variety of grants, scholarships, to kind of make up that financial need. And we'll dig into what that formula looks like later. But for a lot of folks, this will be where they receive the most amount of financial aid from, and really will be the just most important factor as your students nail down their full list of college applications. So how does that aid get delivered to students, and just really what do these terms mean when I say grants, loans, or scholarships, or work study? You might know all these, but we're just gonna do a quick refresher. Loans are money and funds that a student is borrowing. And so the fact that a student is borrowing these loans, these are funds that have to be repaid. Not while the student's in college, but when they graduate. And loans can come from a variety of sources. And so they can come from the federal, the state, and from third parties as well. We'll have a conversation a little bit later just to kind of grasp the nuances behind student loans, really what can make a student loan friendly versus what can make it predatory. But that is a huge part of a financial aid package and can be included. Second is grants. Grants are good. It's money. It can be called a scholarship or a grant. For our purposes in advising, this really just means money that is the students and does not need to be repaid. And this could also come from a huge variety of sources, whether that is the federal government, the state, the institution, or a third-party scholarship program. And then lastly, we have work study. So work study is just really an agreement between the school or institution or a school and another program that can be included into a financial aid package. So this is there to help meet any required need, and that students will then work, whether that's at a library or in the parking lot, wherever that might be, that there's an agreement there and that the distribution of those, and that a student will then get compensated for it, whether through a stipend or through an hourly basis. So again, those are like the three ways that most students will pay for college, and that is where that comes from. So how do we apply for this? And these really are just going to be like the big four of really just the main forms that a student will have to fill out, and what you'll be helping to work through with them to complete. So the FAFSA, we're going to talk a lot about the FAFSA. The CSS profile, we'll talk a lot about the CSS profile. There are going to be those supplemental institutional state forms. So whether that is like, you know, a one-pager for the state that for a student state, or it could be 3 pages, that will vary state by state. And then lastly, any additional institutional forms. So in addition to either the FAFSA or the CSS, schools can also have their own institutional forms that they might ask a student to fill out in order to get a fuller picture of what their financial need is. So again, these are kind of like the big four things that you're living with at the end of the day, and just being comfortable about and knowing more about too. So we hope that you become really good experts at the FAFSA and CSS, where again, you as an advisor can make the most impact is working with your students so that they understand like what state forms they have to apply to, and then based off their college list, because again, you as the advisor have the most level of in-depth knowledge about your students and what schools they intend to apply to. Being able to have that and understand like, okay, like if they are applying to a certain school that might require additional forms, being ready and understanding like, what do I have to do for my students to make sure they can assemble the information they need. So those are the big four of what we'll get into. Okay. So this is where it gets started, right? This is where most folks begin. And a big milestone for us is filling out the FAFSA, right? And the thing is, even if your high school fellow receives a minimal amount from the federal Pell Grant, what the FAFSA does is that it actually unlocks all other avenues of financial aid. So to be able to receive any kind of state aid or institutional aid, you can't do that unless you submit the FAFSA. So your students really just need to be familiar with this process and just understand what the document is and kind of be very, very comfortable in making sure that this is filled out correctly. Because this isn't really going to be the first year they fill this out, right? As a lot of you probably know, the FAFSA has to be filled out every single year. And so something to be used to, but again, this is kind of the big lock that will then be the key to unlocking every single other piece of financial aid that your students can get. So it opens really soon. It's opening October 1st, and the priority deadline that we set is November 15th. For the FAFSA milestone, we require that all students submit the FAFSA by this day. So you might be saying, Marab, buddy, Val, deadline's in June. Why are you doing this to me? And again, this is where I tell you, friend, that a lot of the schools and states that your student is probably applying to will have earlier deadlines. So for example, if any of your HSFs are applying early action, or earlier decision, or early action to Princeton specifically, they require to actually have the FAFSA completed by November 1st. And so really important that, again, you have the most in-depth knowledge about where your students are applying to and what deadlines are going to be out there for them. But this is also just going to be a really unpredictable year. And if your HSFs are expecting any funding from places that are first come, first serve, DC Tag as actually a place that operates their state aid like that as well, you have to put yourself in the best spot, and that means submitting this documentation early. So it opens October. Really, really be vigilant and really nudge and pressure your high school fellows to get this in as soon as they can accurately, but make sure that they submit this as soon as they can. Okay, quick breakdown of what students are going to be, what students need to do this. First and foremost is just the FSA ID. They have to do this for themselves and for anyone else who will sign the documents, so most likely their parents. And just in general, just be comfortable with their systems and logins. This will be the first of many financial aid logins that they'll have to have. So just good to know where things are, and being really comfortable with the website is a really important skill. And they should also just have, from there, they should have their family's tax information. So again, you as an advising fellow are just kind of like checking in to see if they have it or like have access to it. And not that you are looking at it, you're not seeing it, you're not filling it out for them. You're just seeing if they have it and if they have what they need. If they don't, and you're running into any issues, or if you see your student having any challenges in being able to access their family's tax information, let us know, because that is really, really important, and that is the last piece of documentation really needed to submit the FAFSA. Again, just after that submission process happens, what the FAFSA will produce is a student aid report, and that includes really just a summary of everything that is there to assess what a student's need is going to be, and assessing how much aid they might require to attend a school. Really, and what that does is it produces a number called the estimated family contribution. And really, just quick and short, the estimated family contribution means what a student's family is expected to pay every year. So this doesn't change based off what schools they apply to. The estimated family contribution number is always the same. And again, it's just what they expect from whatever formula and algorithm the FAFSA uses. This is the number they pop out to say this family can pay this amount to pay for college. And we'll get into the nuances of what that means a little bit later on too. Unfortunately, there are some eligibility requirements to being able to fill out the FAFSA. And that students must either be US citizens, permanent residents, or fall into one of these categories. I'm going to pause here in case you need to take a deeper look at these. And then to fill out the FAFSA, really these are kind of like this is the personal information that they would like to have on hand. So it's not just for themselves, but also their parents. So whether that's their personal info, their parents' tax returns, their tax returns, any non-taxable income, any bank statements, farm statements for our folks in rural communities, and then any extraordinary circumstances. And then lastly, school codes. So school codes are the financial aid numbers, or every institution gets a school code, and that is how you add the list of schools to be able to receive your SAR. And so at first, you're only allowed to add 10 schools to be able to receive your FAFSA. You can add more later on, but that is how literally how schools see what a student's need is going to be based off their student aid report from there. A couple things to highlight. I've mentioned this a few times already, but really what is the student aid report? I'm just gonna really read the slide here, but it's the document that is going to list their responses to the FAFSA, right? High school fellows really just, once they see that final document come out, they just have to really make sure that this information is correct and that their expected family contribution is not completely out of left field. And as I mentioned earlier, if your HSF is planning to submit the FAFSA to more than 10 schools, big college list. But what happens is that after your HSF submits the FAFSA to the first 10 schools and receives their student aid report, so once the schools receive their student aid report, they can go back into their FAFSA and make corrections. And so if a school already has a student aid report, that's good enough, and then they can take them off and add another school in. So really just kind of like going in and making corrections to make sure that every single school that they apply to will be able to see their SAR. Okay, next up, we're gonna dig into grants versus loans. And these are like the grants and loans that are available to students by filling out the FAFSA. So by doing this, students will be eligible to receive the federal Pell Grant, right? And this maxes out at close to around like 6.4K a year. And then there is the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. This maxes out at $4,000 a year. and is awarded to students with the greatest need, and this is up to a school's discretion. So again, grants are money that is free. Whatever really gets offered here is something that you take. However, the federal government also offers student loans, right, to make up any additional gap that a student might have. This loan, one of the big loans that they're known for is the Stafford loan, and this can come in two packages, right? So one is either a subsidized loan or unsubsidized. What this means is that when of what's being subsidized here is the interest. So of course, like as all loans are, this is money that they are paying back with interest, right? In a subsidized loan, that interest will start to accrue when that student is no longer in school. As opposed to an unsubsidized loan, that interest will start to accrue from the initial loan date. So another loan, that's kind of really what that looks into, and kind of the differences there. Obviously here you'd want to shoot for a subsidized loan, right? Since that you were paying less in the long term with interest. But again, these are the two types of loans the federal government offer. Another loan that they also offer is the Parent Plus loan for students, and this is usually offered to students who find themselves with a really excessive gap in being able to pay for the cost of college. So what happens here is that to even agree to this, a student's parents also become liable to help pay back this amount. And so this is really the entire cost of college that isn't covered by aid and isn't covered by any institutional need. And so this can be a huge, huge amount, and is usually offered in instances where a school might not already be a financially fit option. So just something to be very, very conscious of and be very, very aware of is that, this requires a parent's information and a parent's agreement to be on the hook for this loan. So again, just be very, very cautious. This is kind of like usually the red flag that I see when a student is applying to a school that is not a financially fit option for them, or is planning to go to a school that is not a financially fit option to them. So to kind of like continue that conversation about loans, I previewed a little earlier, and just like the nuances behind what they mean. I just want to call out that just the word loan can be especially triggering to a family, to the students that you're working with, and it can unpack a lot, right? There is this like, notion that, loans are evil and they're bad, and that's not it either, right? Taking student loans at like a small and manageable rate isn't the end of the world. And for a lot of students, that could look like taking out a $2,000 Stafford loan every semester to just be able to cover any missing essentials, right? And so that might sound small at first, right? At $2,000 a semester, but that would total up to around $12,000 once you graduate in 4 years. So again, that's not an insane amount for a lot of folks, but that means having a plan, right? Not just when you come out of school and look at your debt and say, oh no. That means just being super, super forthright in that if you are taking this loan, that whatever it ends up being at the end of 4 years is really the amount that you should expect to pay plus interest. And again, it's just like, you'll see more of this as we talk about financial aid award letters in the spring. But know that is coming, and that conversation is something that we really would love for you guys to be adept at and truly understand, but it is what it is. There are also, in addition to the loans offered by the federal government, there are some like just incredibly predatory student loans that are also out there, offered by third parties, that are built to put college graduates into just crushing and overwhelming debt. Again, your impact as an advising fellow here is to just talk this out, right, with your HSFs, and like, when does something look too good to be true? What does this loan look like when you're in college versus when you finally get out? Really just the entire conversation about us with financially fit schools is usually so that students have a reasonable option to have a higher education, and then also not be absolutely crushed by debt by going into school as well. So again, your role here is just to kind of assess, have a conversation, and see what these options look like. But students are also prepared to like know what might come out of this. So this will be a much bigger conversation in the spring, but just know that this could be something that's offered to your students and that you might need to speak to. Okay, and transition. Next big form is going to be the CSS Profile. It's another online application administered by the College Board that is used by close to 400 schools to offer non-federal aid. So you'll catch that the schools that offer the most amount of institutional aid will usually require students to fill out the CSS Profile. Our milestone requirement for the CSS is to be completed by December 15th or by your earliest school's deadline. Some quick details. Again, like the FAFSA, this also opens October 1st. The deadline to complete should, again, either be by our priority deadline by December 15th or 2 weeks before the earliest school's priority deadline. So just be very, very vigilant about the schools on your student's college list and where they are sending their CSS to. Unlike the FAFSA, this is not a free application. So the CSS costs $25 to apply. In addition to that first submission, each additional school report is going to cost $16 each. So again, think about that conversation where if a student is applying to 6 schools, that's 25 for the first and then 16 for the next, 16 for each application from there. So it can add up and it could be a cost that a lot of people aren't expecting to pay. So be aware. There are waivers available for students who did receive an SAT waiver. Could be complicated this year as any folks maybe opted out of the SAT, but know if their student had a waiver that they could get a few CSS waivers as well. Or if their family income is below 45K, they already receive CSS waivers from here. So just be aware and understand that like if a student's college list includes 6 or 7 schools from the CSS profile, that this is a cost that they can incur. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to be required by many selected schools and just provides a different financial picture that is used to determine school aid. It's a really incredibly detailed application and just document. It's going to take a long time to fill out. For most folks, the FAFSA takes around like 30 minutes to an hour to fill out. For the CSS, that can definitely be 45 to 2 hours. So again, your role as an AF is just to make sure that your HSF is able to complete and flagging for us if you find out that they can. So this is a really, really important document. It's kind of like our big indicator for whether or not your student is applying to a balanced college list or at least a school that offers a financial fit. So it's a very daunting application. If you're having this conversation with your students that feel nervous about getting this out, again, just let someone know. Don't feel like you're suffering through this alone. And then lastly, for the CSS, in addition to the main application, they can be asked to submit supplemental forms specific to a college or university that can be used for additional awards. These forms will usually ask for information that is not asked for in the FAFSA. And lastly, in some instances, there's a chance that colleges will require further documentation to submit. So your HSFs have to be really, really vigilant in that it feels like even if they're done and they're just like, yeah, I did the FAFSA, yeah, I did the CSS, yeah, I did my state's institutional aid. It feels really silly to just say out loud, but high school fellows got to check their email. They got to check their profiles, their student login profiles for schools that they're set up with, and just be really, really confident that as they are expecting to receive financial aid packages, that they have done everything on their end to submit any documentation that a school is asking for. Okay, and next up we have some state aid programs. So this is again where you as an advising fellow just make a ton of impact in being able to offer the guidance here for each state, and for some folks it might be a lot more of a lift, and for others it could be less. But these are usually grant funds that are offered to students who stay in state. To be eligible for this, this will also usually require students complete the FAFSA. And then you'll see a couple of examples of state programs here, like New York STAT program or Ohio's College Opportunity Program. Again, just a few. These usually do require that students like either stay in state and have an income limit of whatever income that the state decides. So these will vary. Really encourage you to kind of like look state by state. There's a resource that we shout out at the end that kind of breaks this down for by state that you can also use to get a head start on what your student might need to do based off where they live. Okay. So that was the big three of aid. But really, what does it actually look like when you receive financial aid packages in the spring? So first and foremost, every school will have to list their cost of attendance numbers. So when I say cost of attendance, this means the total of all cost, right? So that's tuition, that's fees, that's room and board, that's transportation that they might have to incur to travel there, and any personal expenses, right? Just the expenses to just eat and live and be a person. Schools have to calculate all of that to provide a fair cost of attendance number. What happens from there is that a student, what they'll do in deciding a financial aid package is that they'll subtract the EFC to determine a student's financial aid. So they'll subtract the estimated family contribution, this is the number that the FAFSA is saying that your family can provide, and that the student is always going to be on the hook to pay for. And that will be, and what comes out is their financial need. So when I say financial need, that's the amount a college will hopefully seek to award through a package. So for example, if a school says they offer 100% of need met, that means the student will be expected to still pay out their EFC, but a school will meet every single number from the cost of attendance that doesn't account for the EFC. So it can sound complicated, but really just know that there is no getting around like that estimated family contribution. And just like that is like what a college is saying that a family will have to pay. In a past life, actually, I worked for a scholarship program, and if a student had their entire need met by the school, but say their EFC was around $1,000, right, and that would be the remainder of the gap from them to cover their cost of attendance. We as a scholarship program couldn't actually give that student any funds, and if we did, what would happen is that the school would then take away their own aid to maintain that EFC number. So that financial need number is kind of like what you should expect to be working on the most to make sure that your student is just doing the most to help cover that gap. But that's, again, when we talk about 100% need met schools, that doesn't mean that they don't have to pay for anything. The EFC is still a huge indicator into what they would have to pay. Some more things to call out about the expected family contribution. And just what if you get an EFC that looks a lot higher than what you were expecting or than what your student was expecting? This is really just important, and again, it feels silly to say, but just gotta make sure everything's correct, right? If a student has a really high FC, and this is just like absolutely not what you're expecting, you gotta, they gotta really make sure they fill this out correctly, and talk out any situations with wherever they're also applying to. If a student has a really high EFC and it is accurate, there may be like additional ways to counter that, right? So outside of either like merit awards or anything that can be just included to really work through what that EFC number looks like, is going to vary school by school. So HSF should look at what's available and kind of just be super vigilant about connecting with financial aid officers from there. And at schools that they're applying to seek out any next steps. Again, if you just see anything that's incredibly off, tap someone in for help, right? Reach out to your hive mind if you connect with your head advising fellow or just in general your campus lead. One last question that's going to be new for this year is the FAFSA and CSS use tax information from what we call as prior year. So what this means is that the tax information that you're using for this cycle to fill out these forms will actually not account for any income loss that has happened during COVID-19. So to get ahead of this, we are just recommending that if your HSF is in this position, that they already be in close contact with any of their schools that they are ready to submit any supplemental information for. what we've kind of just have gathered from our partners is that every school is really handling this in a different way, or could be handling this differently. So it's important that your high school fellow is kind of like almost like owning like any circumstances or documenting any circumstances that can show a big change of income. So just being able to advocate for what's happening and what happens to their folks that is not being showed in the 2019 tax returns. So going from there and just kind of like understanding that why they have a bigger financial need and going and making sure they have what they need to talk to financial aid officers and why they might need an adjusted package. Okay. So some more resources for you guys to look into the curriculum. Read the curriculum, please. It's there. Studentaid.ed.gov is actually really, really helpful and kind of outlines a lot of what we talked about here today. Obviously, CSS Profile information is really valuable. And then lastly, the last website there provides a state-by-state guide into available tuition assistance programs. So just really, really helpful to organizing and seeing if you have a student in Texas and California and Florida or Ohio, just understanding like that, because their experience can vary very widely. So that is there for you for specific state-by-state forms. For some, you might have to fill them out now. Some are going to be in the spring. But again, just something to bookmark and keep a tab on as you get to those deadlines. And really, this is the checklist. I'm just going to kind of like read across the slides, but something that could be really, really important for you to highlight in your next session is to, one, make sure that your student has a federal student aid ID, that they have a plan to get all the required financial aid documentation. In addition to finalizing that college list, that financial aid deadlines for all their schools are also there. Being super, super sure on which colleges on their list require the CSS profile and anything above that. What their state offers tuition, their state tuition programs are, and then the biggest of check marks is completing the FAFSA and then completing the CSS. So again, these are two really big milestones for us. This is like a big indicator whether or not a student's going to have a good experience in this program, and whether or not they will go to college is by being able to have a financial aid option, and that only happens by filling out these financial aid documents. So make sure that you get on that and are there to support. Okay, previewing the webinar for next month. We're actually going to dig a little bit deeper for special circumstances and next steps. This was really just meant as an overview and just general guidance. We didn't get to talk about like dependency for non-custodial parents and when in which documentation to fill out from there. Folks that might have a immigration status that doesn't apply, and then what to do when students get flagged for verification. So we're still going to dig into financial aid. This is something that a lot of advising fellows ask for, especially as we get into more special circumstances, but that is going to be coming up in October. So next up, just overall for the program wide, there was a milestone that happened a couple days ago, and that all high school fellows must have submitted their college list for review. We're still missing a few, so making sure that if you are one of those folks that needs to submit whose students still need to submit their college list, make sure you're doing that. If your high school fellow has been signed up for CBOS, they can link that they've completed the FAFSA, and that makes them eligible to receive additional scholarship amount based upon whatever stage CBOS is in right now. October webinar, we just talked about it, and then the next milestone that is coming up is the FAFSA milestone in November 15th. So milestone season, it's here, it's coming, it's fast and furious. We are so ready. And I think that's it for me. If you have any questions or concerns, like really just reach out to your campus lead. If you find that you're running into more questions you're not able to answer, just tap into the fellowship on campus, like tap into people. Just know that you're not doing this alone. But I hope that we have also given you tools and resources to also be able to figure out any situations that might come up with your students as well. So with that, I'm going to log off, and I'm excited to hear some reviews, and I will see you all next month.